Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast with former Auburn head football coach, 2010 national champion Callie Chizik is brought to you by Compassion International. It is the holiday season, and we're all looking for a way to make a difference, a way to give back, a way to help someone, a way to bless someone. Compassion International is the perfect place to do just that. Your $38 a month sponsors a child and releases them from poverty. Every child deserves a chance to have food, education, and medical care, vocational training, and really every child deserves a chance to have hope. And that's what you provide when you sponsor a child with Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum, compassion.com/sports spectrum. For $38 a month, you can make a difference in a child's life. Sponsor a child today. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum and sponsor a child. Today's guest on the podcast, part one of a two-part conversation with former Auburn head football coach, 2010 national champion Callie Chizik is our guest here on the podcast. And I met Coach Chizik back in 2011. So that's the year following his national championship run with Auburn. And of course, Cam Newton being a big part of that, winning the Heisman Trophy that year, and then certainly playing great enough to get Auburn all the way to an undefeated national championship in 2010. And Coach Chizik came in 2011 to ESPN, and again in 2012 as the Auburn head football coach. And they had what they called SEC sort of media days at ESPN. And I was assigned in my job at that time to walk around and be the guide for Auburn. So Coach Chizik and I and a couple of his wonderful staff members got to walk around, and I got to take him from show to show and make sure he was taken care of, and got to form a relationship and a friendship with Coach Chizik, and have been able to stay in touch with him ever since. And I love following him on Twitter, by the way, at Coach Callie Chizik in his words of chisdom. So go on Twitter there. You'll love seeing Coach Chizik's words of chisdom. But this is part one of a two-part podcast. And in the first part, we talk about his role now as a broadcaster. He works with the SEC Network and ESPN as a college football analyst. So I talk about, and we talk about, what that's like being an analyst now compared to his days of coaching. And we also get into family life and why the broadcasting job that he is in has allowed him to be more present with his family, his two girls and his son Callie in high school, a senior in high school and being recruited right now. So that is kind of where he is as a broadcaster, and probably a good reason why he's not coaching right now, because of family. We also talk about his faith journey. When did his faith in Christ begin and become real to him, as well as the coaching grind. Coach Chizik has been a part of a lot of different programs, from Middle Tennessee to Clemson to Stephen F. Austin to UCF, Central Florida, and then to Auburn, and then to Texas, and then to Iowa State, and then back to Auburn. So he's been all around the country, and that is a coaching grind. So I asked Coach about that as well here in part one of the podcast. So take a listen. I love him. He's such a great guy, and just a lot of fun, great storyteller. Callie Chizik, former Auburn head football coach, 2010 college football national champion, joins us here on the podcast. Take a listen. Callie Chizik, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate it, man. I'm glad to be on your show, man. It's an honor.
Thank you, and I appreciate you coming on, and looking forward to diving into your journey, both from the faith perspective, from coaching. But let's start with the television work you're doing, working with the SEC Network, and I just wonder how that broadcasting role has been going for you as compared to coaching for so many years. You've been doing it now a few years, and just wondering how that role is going for you.
Yeah, Jason, it's really been awesome. I mean, it's it's a scenario which allows me, I love this game of football. Yeah. I mean, I've been around it my whole life. I've done it my whole life. I mean, since I can remember at 5 years old, sitting on my dad's lap, football's just been a very important piece of the puzzle for me. And to be able to step away from coaching and still be involved in it, doing the TV bit with being an analyst for the SEC Network and just working for ESPN, and they've been really gracious with me and letting me have an opportunity on Friday nights to see my son play every football game for the last 2 years. has been a true blessing. And then still be able to do studio stuff on Saturdays, do some games in the booth, and just be able to stay close to the game of football. It's been really important, and it really plays and kind of intersects well with me being able to be home for my last 2 years of my son's high school football and baseball career, and just being able to be present around here much more than I had been, obviously, if I was coaching. So I love it. It's been great. I hope they'll continue to let me do it for a while because I've had a blast at it.
Tell me about watching your son. I think his name is Callie, right? Your son, Callie, who I met. I think we were talking about this before our interview when he was like 10 years old and you came up to ESPN and I was still working there and kind of showed you around while you were still coaching at Auburn. And now he's playing football. I wonder, for you, a coach, are you able to kind of separate the coach Gene Chizik and the dad Gene Chizik, or do those things sort of intersect sometimes?
I will say at times I am, Jason. At times I am. It's really been cool. I'm on the other side of this now. He's being recruited,
Yeah.
so I'm on the other side of that. I've been able to watch a lot of practices, a lot of 7-on-7 tournaments, and every football game he's played in for the last 2 years. Currently, they're in the quarterfinals of the state playoffs, which is awesome. That'll be this Friday night. But I've been able to really watch him and really look. I stay out of everything unless there's just something that absolutely needs to be said in terms of how he's playing, both good and advice that I feel at the time is necessary. But for the most part, I let him ask me for any help. Like I told him when I came home 2 years ago, I said, look, I'll give you as much help as you want or as little help as you want. You tell me. You're grown up enough now to understand what I can bring to the table. And if you're wanting it, let's do it. If you're not and you got it, I respect that as well. But it's been a really cool experience for me. And, I've spent all my life, 30 years of coaching other kids. And, it's been very unique for it to now be my own, where I'm not necessarily coaching him, but I'm here every day to see exactly what he does and how he's grown as a football player and how he's performed in games and in practice. And it's been just a cool situation for me. And 2 years ago when I decided to do this, Jason, it was a huge deal for me because, I love the game, and I jumped out of the game not knowing if I would get back in it or not. But it's been probably the best decision family-wise, not just for him. I'm around my daughters who go to Auburn University, and of course, this is where we live. We never moved, after my stint was done at Auburn. And our family's been back together for 2 straight years, and that's a huge, huge piece of the puzzle for me because that's always been the most important thing on my plate. And it's just been outstanding to be able to get us all together, and we've been able to do that for 2 years now.
I remember there was a couple of years ago where sort of on the Twitterverse, there was a picture of you looking, I think it was looking at your daughter. She was getting ready to go to a dance or the prom or something. And you kind of had this, like, don't even think about it look as you're looking at her. But I'm a dad of a 14-year-old daughter. So maybe we have a lot of dads here listening. Just maybe start with some advice on how, because your kids are in college now, how you navigated those high school years with your daughters and just being a dad. What was that like?
Well, it was the joy of my life. It was, when I was young growing up, believe it or not, I always envisioned what my family would be like because it was very important for me. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a dad, and I wanted to be, I wanted our family unit to be probably what people dream of, you know what I mean? And I really wanted that. I wanted the fantasy of the whole family and it being that family that you love being around and you love being part of. And I wanted that for my kids and my wife. And, it's like I said, it's been the joy of my life. And, people always, think of football coaches especially in the role when you're a head coach and there's so much attention on you specifically. I want, uh, it was important for me to differentiate myself and know that, look, football is what I do. It's not who I am. Who I am is a father and a husband and a leader of a family. And that's always been the most important thing to me, but I've had a blast with it. I've always been very intentional in my parenting. Even when I was coaching, my refuge was coming home. That's what I got. I had a lot of solace in that. And, I've always been extremely close to my daughters and my son, but my daughters are older. And I was always very intentional. I wanted to make sure that they, even though dad was gone a lot, they didn't feel like that dad was never present. And when I was home, I was 100% present. I wasn't one of these guys that came home and picked up the, remote and watched TV and stared at the TV for an hour and a half and then went to bed. So, I was just always very intentional, and that's a choice. That's just a choice that people make. And I always made the choice that that's how I was going to be, and I was not deviating off that. And it's really allowed me to have a phenomenal relationship with my children, which I cherish more than anything on this earth. And that's the relationship with my wife and my kids and us as a family. So, if I had any advice to anybody out there, I would say make sure you're intentional, because it doesn't just happen by accident.
Yeah, it's really good. We're talking to Gene Chizik here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. All right, let's go back, because you said you remember being 5 years old and sitting on your dad's lap and watching and just being interested in even football. So take us back to the early days. I know you grew up in Florida. What was life like as a kid for you?
Well, I literally had two of the greatest parents in the world, and they raised four kids. I was the youngest. My dad was a high school football coach, then became a high school principal. My mom was a nurse. They always worked really, really hard. Back in the day, we didn't run around with a ton of money or any of those things.
Yeah.
We were very modest. We didn't go without, but we certainly weren't, out there in terms of just having everything we want at our disposal. And I appreciate that. We were very modest means. And I came from two loving parents that worked really, really hard, and they cared about us. And, my childhood with my dad's my hero. He was a World War II Marine that was a decorated Bronze Star winner in Okinawa, fought 4 years in Okinawa as a Marine. Actually was playing football on scholarship. And when the war broke out, he went and enlisted, which was, a unique scenario, but that's how my dad was. And that's one of the reasons I looked up to him so much, and just who he was, and the character and the mark of the man was a lot. And he represented that well for me to look at and try to model. And then my mom was this hardworking lady that just, she just grinded and worked, the graveyard shift at the hospital, and then come home and get us off to school and try to sleep 4 or 5 hours a day before we came back home, and she would repeat the next day. And so I learned that, hard work, and I learned all of the things that they taught us. That's how you prosper in life. It's about hard work. It's about being committed to your family. It's about, what you're doing for other people. And that really sums up my parents and my childhood, because, I look back on it, it wasn't always perfect. I'm not trying to paint that picture, but it was certainly appreciated as now I get up into the ages where they were trying to get us out of the house and get us off to college and get us grown up. That's where we're at now with our kids. So I can really look back on them and what they did with us and really have a high appreciation for it.
I know your faith is important to you now. What was that like growing up? Were you a church kid? Did you pray around the dinner table? Was faith a part of your guys' life as a kid?
Yeah, it was, Jason. And, it was different. I was raised in a Catholic household. My mom was Catholic and converted my dad. And we went to church every Sunday. And I was I was raised to, believe in that there was a God, and that, he provided, and that, um, that, you know, your life is really guided by something bigger and a bigger spiritual being than yourself. Where I got further along in my faith, though, was when I got past college. I got into coaching, and I started being around some guys that really were great mentors for me in terms of Christianity and what it really was. And where I've really changed is that, I'm not going to say that when I was growing up, I didn't really understand this personal relationship uh, with Christ and what that means. But I've grown exponentially in that regard over the years. And a lot of that has to do with my wife. And, when I met her, she was very open about, look, let's go to different churches, and let's really look around, and let's really see what's out there from a Christian standpoint, and, not be pigeonholed into, being a Catholic, or, she was raised Methodist, not being pigeonholed into either one of those simply because that's all we know. And then as we got out there, we started really experiencing great relationships with some people that were really into the Christian faith, and were really pushing the fact that there's a personal relationship out there that you need to have, and it can grow stronger every day. And what I found out over the years is that my personal relationship with Christ and how it's grown has been exponential. And I don't go around beating guys over the head with the Bible. You know what I mean? But I also have no problem sharing it. And I don't claim to be perfect, but I know that I got a relationship with Christ, and I know that my life is nothing without that. So any of the things on this earth that people would look at and say, this guy's accomplished this, or this guy's accomplished that. And quite frankly, that's what people do. They look at what you have and how much money you have, or what you've done with your profession, and they think that that really counts. Well, it really doesn't count. Like I said, it's what you do. It's not who you are. And what I've learned is that, Christ in my life has provided me all of these things that people would look at and say, wow, look what accomplishments have happened.
Yeah.
I'm nothing. I've got zero without what he's provided for me. And I am very aware of that. And I don't wake up ever in the morning, before my feet hit the floor, I'm thanking God for everything he's provided, because I have not done anything, and I have figured that out. Everything is done through him. And, I'm just very blessed that he's had a lot of favor on my life and my family. And I'm very appreciative of that. And I hope that my faith and the way I approach it continues to grow, because I think it's a nonstop scenario that you continue to do until you're not here on this earth anymore.
Absolutely. Now, was there a moment for you where it just clicked on the relationship side of it? Because I know your wife had a big role in that. You went to a few churches, you tried some different things out, just kind of opened your eyes and opened your mind a little bit. But was there a moment? For a lot of people, there's that moment where it just says, oh yeah, that makes sense. My heart's open. I'm saying yes to this.
I think this, instead of more of a moment, Jason, it would probably be more of an individual or individuals that really molded where I am and what I believe today. It was, I believe God brings people into your life for a reason. I think everybody has a purpose, and he brought individuals into my life, and ironically, it was through football. And you sit there and you look at why do I love this game so much? Why has this game been such a part of my life? Because it's changed my life, not just it's provided a lifestyle for me, but it's brought people into my life that I probably would not have met had I not done this, that changed my life and the way I look at things, and the way I, try to hold myself accountable with doing the right things, and just living a Christian life. And look, I stumble as much as or more than anybody out there, but I'm very conscientious when I do. And, I try my best to, live a life that would be pleasing to what God has in store for us and what his plans are for us. But those people, specific people, not necessarily an encounter, but those specific people had a huge, huge role in my life.
We're talking to Callie Chizik here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. So you go on and you play your college ball at Florida, and suddenly coaching starts to come into the picture at some point. When was that? And was coaching always something that you kind of desired to do even during your playing days?
Well, Jason, I wasn't sure. I was like a lot of college kids. I started out in business school.
Yep.
And then realized, I'm sitting in class one day going, look, economics really does nothing for me right now.
Right.
Like so many of us. And I'll never forget that moment. I was sitting in class at the University of Florida. I'm going, what am I doing in business school? So, I mean, literally, I just went and like within a week, I went over and just said, look, let me change my major. So I changed over to education, thinking that I'd be a teacher, maybe a coach. Wasn't sure. My father was a principal at the time. So I thought, maybe I go into coaching and then be a principal. I wasn't really sure. And then when I graduated, one of my former coaches approached me and said, man, I would love for you to come coach with me. And I jumped all over. I was like, heck yeah, I'm in. I didn't even hesitate. But I can't sit there and say that this is what I knew I was going to do my whole life. But when the opportunity presented itself, I was very fired up. And once I got back in it, Jason, and I was coaching and I was around those kids and I knew I had influence and I knew I could have positive impacts, that's when I said, this is for me. This is exactly what I've been looking for. I've been bouncing around with what I really want to do. And it was at that point, because I was teaching at the time, believe it or not, I was teaching third grade.
Is that right?
And yeah, I was a third grade teacher and I was coaching at the high school. And that's when I realized I love this. And, I thought, man, I think coaching is really where I want to go. So I did the high school coaching scenario for 2.5 years before I got into the college world, but loved every minute of it. And like I said, once I dove into the coaching part of this coaching piece of this, I realized this is what I need to be. This is where I need to be, and this is what I need to do.
And yet that coaching life isn't an easy one. And you bounced around a little bit, Middle Tennessee, Stephen F. Austin, UCF, Auburn, then Texas and Iowa State. So there's a lot going on there in the travels of your coaching career. Tell me what life was like during those formative years as you were just cutting your teeth and just getting started in the college coaching world, because it is not an easy world. It is a grind, and you're living through that.
Yeah, it is a grind. And one of the things when I first got started in college coaching, I knew there was going to be a lot of moving around. And I really wanted to get my career on its path. And I wanted to, really dive in and make sure that the college scene was really what I wanted. And I wanted to get my legs on the ground in terms of a career. That's why I waited. I waited a good bit till I got married and had a family. Just because at the beginning of my career, I realized there was going to be several moves, and there were. It was Clemson, then it was Middle Tennessee, then it was Tennessee for about 2 months before I went to Middle Tennessee, and then it was Stephen F. Austin. So within like a span of probably 3 years, I'd moved 3 times. And, me being single and not having to have a family that was, I was dragging all around the country at different states and different stops. I thought that was important because I didn't really feel like that would have been fair. Not that people don't do it and it works. It's just that's kind of what I wanted to be able to do. Is get it on my own and get moving and get my feet on the ground and make sure that this is what I wanted to do for a living. Well, about 4 years into college coaching, I realized this is it, man. This is what I want. I love every minute of it. I love the recruiting. I love the influence. Like I realized that in high school. And so once I did that, man, my journey was spectacular. I wouldn't trade. There's not one move that I would take back. There's not one regret of any job that I had. I was exposed to so many phenomenal people, just great people. And I look back on my, middle 20s, late 20s, when I was at the Middle Tennessees and the Stephen F. Austins of the world. Man, I'll tell you, it was just great formative years for me, both in coaching and as a person, as a human being, an individual. And again, that's where a lot of the people came into my life that really helped me kind of mold my Christian faith. And it was a phenomenal experience. And I wouldn't take any of it back. But I learned so much football. I learned so much about life. I learned so much about being on my own and traveling the world and meeting different people and seeing different things and, and understanding the business and what it takes to, try to get to the top of the business. Because I've never done anything, Jason, where I didn't want to be the best there is out there. Right. I mean, when I was at Stephen F. Austin, man, I wanted to win the national championship.
Yeah.
And. Yeah. So I was learning how to work in that direction and try to work to accomplish those things. And what I learned is that, you don't chase jobs. If you're good at what you do, then jobs chase you. And, I've never called one person for a job. They've always called me. And I've never been this guy that's on the phone making phone calls trying to get, guys to hire me. I've tried to do my job the best I could and then let the chips fall in place. And again, a lot of that's just because God has had great favor on me and put me in the right spots at the right time, to be honest with you.
Thanks to Gene Chizik. That was part one of our conversation with the former Auburn head football coach, 2010 national champion. Tomorrow, in part two of our conversation, we talk about the Iron Bowl and what that rivalry with Auburn and Alabama means. We also talk about Cam Newton, and we get an idea of what Coach Chizik thinks about the way that Cam Newton's career has developed. And it's a heck of a career when you really look at what Cam's done in the NFL. Completely changed the game and been such a unique player in the National Football League for so many years. And then I had to ask the question, of course, does he want to coach again? So tomorrow on part two of the podcast, you'll hear Coach Chizik's answer on whether he hopes to coach again in football. We thank Coach Chizik for joining us. We thank you for listening. And of course, we thank Compassion International for sponsoring this podcast. $38 a month brings food, education, medical care, vocational training, all done in Jesus' name through Compassion International. Sponsor a child today. It's the holiday season. We're all looking for a place to give back, to help, to provide hope to someone. This is a great chance to do that with a child across the continent. $38 a month, compassion.com/sports spectrum. That's the website, compassion.com/sports spectrum, and sponsor a child today. Thanks for listening to part one of our two-part conversation with Gene Chizik, former Auburn head football coach. You can reach us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at sports_spectrum. And of course, you can email me, jason@sportsspectrum.com. We'll see you next time, tomorrow actually, for part two of our conversation with Coach Gene Chizik here on the Sports Spectrum Podcast. Have a great rest of your day.